For over 35 months, Russia's been waging war on Ukraine. Today we will examine the military situation. I'm Julian Rupke and this is Build Situation Room. We're kicking off with video footage from the Russian region of Krasnodar. Over there, the Ukrainian army conducted a bombing on yet another pipeline just yesterday morning, a pipeline running from Kazakhstan to the Black Sea. Here we see the impact of a Ukrainian kamikaze drone at a pumping station of this pipeline. And of course, once again, the clear intention is to disrupt and destabilize the Russian oil and gas industry, as well as to cause disturbances in the fuel industry. And it's not completely clear whether the export here or the forwarding of oil and gas has actually come to a halt, or if operations have resumed once more. We certainly have a situation where a large fire has broken out, and once again, Ukraine has struck deep within Russian territory, in this case in Krasnodar. In the area by Turkey, there's a lengthy pipeline running quite extensively, meant to strike and attack a Russian pipeline there. We're making our way over to the region of Kursk, staying within Russian territory, to take a closer look at some footage that even for Russian military bloggers were quite incredible to watch. Because we see another attack, a major offensive by the Russian army along with North Korean infantry on the front. This attack is once again going completely wrong. As I've mentioned before, it's quite evident here. So we have different tanks driving here, or armored personnel carriers moving alongside very large groups of infantry advancing towards the Ukrainian forces. Right from the beginning, the Ukrainians are more or less keeping an eye on everything. First, with kamikaze drones, we see again the number of soldiers involved. That's a really large crowd just running across the open field, just like before. Yeah, completely and utterly reckless, one might say, as they continue advancing toward the Ukrainian positions. And the interesting thing, and that's why even Russian bloggers have said, how can that be, is that these tanks drive in winter with the red Soviet flag. And that's not just any modified flag, but it actually is the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union, which was displayed here across several tanks, makes it even more visible for the Ukrainian attackers in the winter and snow. We always see that when the drones are approaching. Here we see it again, clearly visible, the red flag on top of the tank. The first one also made sure that the commanders placed importance on these tanks and armored personnel carriers being clearly marked with these flags while on the move, and lets these tanks drive straight into the Ukrainian minefield first and then over the open field. There we see it displayed here, so these are mines exploding across the open field heading towards the Ukrainian position, which ultimately makes these tanks easy prey for the Ukrainian army. The whole situation is near Malaya Lochnia, in the northern part of the region, still under Ukrainian control. Here we see the red flag on top again, so the tanks have come to a halt. First, the chains got damaged and fell off due to the mines. And then the kamikaze drones are deployed. Once again, there are massive casualties on the Russian side. We'll definitely pixelate that and cut some sections out. Still, it's quite evident, and the Soviet flag is rather visible, that once the Ukrainians have finished handling the vehicles, they take care of the infantry. And in this case, it has once again reached catastrophic proportions for the Russian army. The whole thing went completely wrong when we look at it on the map, because they tried to advance further towards Malaya Lochnia, aiming to capture the small village of Nikolsky. And the Russians had already half-controlled this place in recent days. However, as we can see here on the map, the area is now back under Ukrainian control. The Russians and the North Koreans have now withdrawn from Nikolsky, and both Malaya Lochnia itself, the larger settlement, and the small suburb Nikolsky remain under Ukrainian control. That means, despite all efforts, as we've just seen, efforts that are just so ruthless and so direct and so obvious even for the Ukrainian defenders, that they can be easily countered. Despite all these efforts, Kursk stays, and part of it, this area here, stays even as the US and Russia negotiate on whatever, without Ukrainian and European participation, remain under Ukraine's control. We shift from Western Russia to Eastern Ukraine, focusing on the Andriivka region, and here we have new footage showing us that how the Russians are attacking the small town of Ulakli. We reported 2 days ago that this town is now partially back under Russian control. But here too we see a frontal assault by the Russians, which was conducted with such superiority that despite the heavy losses, which we will also see here shortly, the Russians took Ulakli in the end. We see here how the Ukrainians use diverse munitions. We're about to see the deployment of cluster munitions. Often we notice that tanks and infantry vehicles hit mines and then face quick attacks by kamikaze drones. So a very similar picture. And here you can also see the moment. So we have basically the vehicle that was taken out here, the vehicle that was incapacitated, and also the third one that was immobilized. And we then see the infantrymen running out, trying to find cover, and then having to move on foot further into the village of Ulagli. The situation, once again, extremely deadly and quite challenging for the Russian army. We also always see footage with the kamikaze drones which show us, yes, we're here in Ulagli, and we'll look at it on the map shortly. But in the end, the Russians, with the roughly 10 vehicles that were deployed, likely managed to reach the small town with more than 100 soldiers and have established a foothold there, and, as we can see from the recent footage, have managed to capture at least 5 Ukrainian defenders, depicted right here. That means, as of now, according to Deep State Map, our map provider, Ulagli is mostly under Russian control. Movement that we've already noticed in the past few days, which we've also shown on the map, but now accompanied by material that shows us Ulagli, a specific place, which was roughly here, and we see about 2/3 under Russian control, with a third still contested. This means Ukrainians are there, and they remain because, at least according to Deep State Map, there are still some Ukrainian troops remaining near Dakhny, and they obviously need to be carefully taken out of this almost closed pocket once again, and have to move to Konstantinopel for strategic reasons. And that has already become extremely difficult because we're observing another Russian advance in the latest days, making its way from the south heading towards Konstantinopel. This advance was actually completely repelled. That means all the Russians were indeed eliminated and the place remains completely under Ukrainian control. Nevertheless, the whole situation is extremely difficult because we can see it here in the north as well in Andriivka, this larger place that I myself visited in September last year, which currently is now predominantly under Russian control. That means it's once again a very challenging and complex situation for the Ukrainians, who have to be extremely cautious to ensure they don't end up losing a significant portion of their contingent, their defenders, at the last crucial moment. We just witnessed that 5 Ukrainian soldiers have been apprehended in Ulagli, where they are currently being detained by the Russian army. And the Ukrainians are, of course, now making every conceivable effort to ensure that the other 50 to 100 soldiers stationed there do not end up suffering the same unfortunate fate. From Andriivka, we move a bit further north to the Pokrovsk region. There too, we have received new footage that clearly shows us why the Russian advance in Pokrovsk and the surrounding areas has practically come to a complete standstill. We've been repeatedly stating for days now that the Russians no longer have any vehicles left. We've additionally demonstrated that nearly every single vehicle belonging to the Russian army was lost on their journey toward Pokrovsk. The Russians themselves have also criticized this, releasing videos showing the so-called Road of Death, several kilometers long, where almost every vehicle has been destroyed. We're talking about hundreds of vehicles, both civilian and military, that the Russians were moving to the front. What is the consequence of that? The consequence is what we see here, namely that Udakhne, a place west of Pokrovsk, is now being attacked solely by infantry. And the whole thing is, of course, an absolutely deadly endeavor. It's hard to imagine. So, this is a large, snowy open field, and we have 5 Russian soldiers here moving across this field, across this kilometer-wide open area towards Udakhne to establish a foothold there. And the footage from the Ukrainians shows that the 5 gradually decrease in number. We can now observe the initial artillery impacts occurring around them. At this moment, nothing happens to them yet, but shortly we'll see as cluster munitions are deployed, and this will be when the first Russians begin to fall, so to speak. The first are wounded, and now kamikaze attacks threaten the remaining survivors, once 5, now only 3 left. In the end, we see 1 or 2 more that are continuing to move, just gently raining down. And in that sense, it's extremely difficult for the Russians, after gaining a foothold in Udakhne for the first time, to deploy more troops there, because a large portion of them are emphasized to be killed on the kilometer-long journey without vehicles. We're carefully examining the overall situation around Pokrovsk, observing the area we just recently viewed in the video, specifically referring to Udakhne. This means that this place is still about 2/3 under Ukrainian control. The Russians have established a foothold, and the movement we just saw of the Russian soldiers was indeed in that direction. That means there are large cities here, like Selidov, once home to 23,000 people. It fell to Russia. Novohrodivka, once 8,000 people, also relatively large. These are all larger cities that the Russians have occupied in recent months. But these final kilometers, that means, what would they be? Approximately 20 kilometers or maybe 25 kilometers from Selidov heading towards the current front line. They're trying to flank Pokrovsk in this direction, aiming to cut off the E50 highway to Dnepropetrovsk, to the next oblast. These final 20 kilometers are considered the absolute death zone due to the fact that the Ukrainians are naturally capable of monitoring everything with kamikaze drones coming from both the north and the south. And so we have seen the result is that the Russians indeed just send their soldiers directly out, straight into the field, into the snow, and simply say, yes, if 1 or 2 of you survive from the 5 we send out from this group to reinforce Udakne, where the Russians have already gained a foothold, then that's enough for us. In recent weeks, we've been talking repeatedly about the Russian army using fiber-optic drones. In the meantime, we are also seeing more videos showing that Ukrainians are also relying on fiber-optic drones and that there are quite similar images like the ones we've seen from the Russian side in recent days. What we see here is a sort of garage, a kind of shelter, where the Russians, I hope you can see it here, so outside are the entrances to the garage, and what hangs here is a kind of heavy net. What is meant to prevent access to, for example, FPV kamikaze drones and the watchful gazes of Ukrainians as well. The Ukrainians have figured it all out, they know that now. Inside are vehicles, and they are now flying very cautiously with these fiber-optic guided drones. As I said, much easier for the operator to handle, so they're looking for a small hole and are now inside this garage. In this scene, you can see a T-72 tank, which is in the process of being targeted and attacked by the first drone. And within this bunker or shelter, there's not only the T-72 tank, there is also a Mr. S self-propelled gun. So a self-propelled howitzer of the Russian army, which will soon be in another attack and destroyed. And all this, as mentioned, footage known from the Russians before. This means the precise penetration into these vehicle halls. Then we see the whole thing burning from above. And yet another drone is flying right back in here. In that case, the next day, to specifically target the other vehicle, not the tank, but rather the self-propelled howitzer that is similarly stationed there. And now we see it here on the left side. I think you can see quite well that the approach to the Mr. S, which also costs several million euros, and this vehicle is also being attacked. In other words, the Ukrainians are trying to keep up, also trying to catch up again on the technological advantage that the Russians have built up over the past few months to make up for it a little bit by continuing to rely on radio-controlled kamikaze drones on one hand, which still make up the largest part that the Ukrainians use, but at the same time trying to expand these fiber-optic guided drones more and more, and at least over the past few weeks deploying them increasingly at the front. But not only with fiber-optic drones, but also with traditional FPV kamikaze drones can the Ukrainians continue to achieve significant advantages or major victories. Here we observe yet another video featuring a fully loaded rocket launcher. You can see it there, moving along. So this is a typical Russian army rocket launcher with up to 40 rockets, probably operating about 10 to 20 kilometers behind the front. Why 10 to 20 kilometers? Because on one side, the maximum range is 20 kilometers for these rockets. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are closely observing the entire situation and are launching an attack using a remote-controlled kamikaze drone. And we are aware that they have the capability to cover a distance of up to 20 kilometers. Unless there are extra technical facilities. Now we see the attack of the kamikaze drone. This means we have a double surveillance system, so to speak. One observation drone that watches the whole situation, and then the kamikaze drone. Now we see this huge explosion. This means the launcher, Ural truck, and the missile setup with up to 40 rockets, which were meant to be launched, suddenly explodes, and then there's absolutely nothing left. You can see that there's nothing of the vehicle left, but you can see through the thermal vision using the heat signature, where it's the hottest and beyond the snow, one can clearly observe precisely where this massive explosion actually took place. But it's not just the Russians who continue to have heavy weapon systems like this BM-21 Grad launcher, which we just saw in its last seconds. But Ukrainians also possess heavy weapons, which they keep producing and in large quantities. And we have new footage showing us that the Ukrainian military intelligence, known as GUR, has apparently received self-propelled guns, artillery howitzers, or at least self-propelled artillery systems, all manufactured domestically within Ukraine, namely of the Bodana type. We can see here that the GUR, typical intelligence agency-like, is launching a heavy reconnaissance drone to first assess where the enemy is. However, now, and that's the special thing, it's kept very, very brief here so you don't see it too clearly, probably typical intelligence service behavior again. Now we are witnessing how a Bodana is advancing or moving towards the front line. A 155mm gun capable of firing standard NATO ammunition. And now we are witnessing how this particular Bodana of the Ukrainian military intelligence, in collaboration with the reconnaissance we've just observed from the drones, is carrying out intensive and heavy attacks on houses and towns that are currently occupied by Russian forces. And this is very interesting because on one hand, the Ukrainians are already experiencing a shortage of ammunition and a lack of Western weapons, but this Bodana, which we just saw, from which we only ever see them very briefly, you can see them quite well up front here, so she's currently in position, then she'll probably move backward to hide again. Every month, 20 of these Bodana are produced and delivered in Ukraine. Just imagine, in comparison, only about 2 Panzerhaubitze 2000 are rolled out of production lines monthly in Germany. Simply put, Ukrainians do tenfold more though. It's a different level, not a true self-propelled howitzer. Nonetheless, produce 10 times as many self-propelled guns as Germany currently does. And that's quite a significant technological advantage which has been significantly ramped up in recent years due to wartime circumstances. Nevertheless, we observe that a significant number of Ukrainian self-propelled guns are now produced, enabling even military intelligence to possess their own, thereby allowing them to not only support regular army units effectively, but also on their own, essentially enabling them to attack the enemy using a combination of drone reconnaissance and artillery. Finally, we want to watch a video of the Russian army, a video from a GoPro or another helmet camera of a Russian soldier, and that clearly shows us once again the reality behind the supposedly well-coordinated and modern deployment of the Russian army in Ukraine. What we're seeing is an attack born out of necessity with motorcycles, meaning the Russians are no longer attacking with tanks, no longer with infantry fighting vehicles, or at least not only. But now a significant portion of the Russian assaults is notably being executed using motorcycles. And once more, this culminates in an absolute disaster. We'll just continue to let the video play. Initially, we observe the different units and can hear the noise of the motorcycles in the background, but eventually we recognize how kamikaze drones from the Ukrainians repeatedly strike close by. The drone produces shrapnel carrying an OG-7 warhead, so we see every time that either there is damage to the motorcycle or injuries to the soldiers occur. How you can clearly observe an entire military unit being practically wiped out and thoroughly annihilated right here, all within just a matter of a few brief seconds. We saw the motorcycle lying there, now the next drone comes in. Once more, the 2 soldiers fall over with their motorcycle. And the entire situation is just pure chaos. So it has nothing to do with an organization, nothing to do with a modern army, but Russia must now, because they have lost so many tens of thousands of vehicles in Ukraine, partially relying on civilian motorcycles. And we can most definitely see very clearly where that inevitably leads to when you ride directly into enemy artillery fire or FPV kamikaze drone fire with your own motorcycles. The entire attack, and we've often seen this from the Ukrainian perspective, now also from the Russian perspective, the entire attack is being repelled and fails.